Let's get started. Welcome everybody here and on Zoom. I see that the microphone is ticking, so I'm assuming that the roof mics or the ceiling mics are picking things up, but shout if we become too quiet. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Anna Watts from the University of Amsterdam. She's here to tell us today about work that she does with the NICER experiment. We're very excited to have her here. Anna got her PhD at the University of Southampton, and then moved on to postdoctoral work at NASA Goddard, at MPA, and also at the University of Amsterdam, where she settled and is now a professor. She is, for the next few months, the program director of the joint University of Amsterdam and Free University of Amsterdam bachelors in astronomy and physics. Which nicely combines her interests in astronomy and physics. So Anna, tell us about NICER.
Thank you very much. Well, it's really lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I've been in a kind of month-long serious grant writing hell zone. Basically, so this is my vacation of coming in and actually giving a talk about it. So it's really lovely to be here. So I'm going to talk to you today about NICER. NICER is the Neutron Star Interior Composition Explorer. Horrible, horrible title. Being a NASA mission. It has this beautiful mission patch, basically, which you'll see up here. I also have it on my rucksack and on my computer, and I'm going to come back to that, I think, a little bit at the end as well. So basically, NICER is an X-ray telescope. Its primary science goal is to figure out what is happening within the core of neutron stars. So let me start there by talking about the cores and why exactly they're interesting. So this is my kind of schematic diagram of what is happening within a neutron star. We have essentially remnants of massive stars that have collapsed in. We end up with an object quasi-spherical, very close to spherical, maybe 20 to 30 kilometers in diameter, 1 to maybe 2.5 solar masses of material, so very, very high density. In terms of the structure, we think we have a solid crust. The crust is an ionic lattice, so nuclei, basically in a crystalline lattice, with the composition of the nuclei changing as you go deeper. So gradually becoming more and more neutron rich as you start to go deeper into the crust. At a certain portion in the middle of the crust, we do the outer crust to inner crust transition. And that is the point at which you start to get neutrons dripping out of nuclei as well. So in the inner crust, I still have my crystalline lattice of neutron-rich nuclei. I still have degenerate electron pressure, providing one of the dominant contributions to the pressure. And now I also have neutrons, most likely in a superfluid state as well. And there's a whole other talk to be done on what happens with those superfluid neutrons as well. I carry on going deeper and deeper. I get to maybe 1.5 kilometers down. And finally, I reach the point where the density is high enough where the nuclei start to touch. And at that point, I've reached the crust-core transition. And essentially, the nuclei kind of meld into each other. And at this point, we have nuclear goo. So highly technical term, and probably about the best description you're going to get of what we think is happening in the core. Because our nuclear physics colleagues have all kinds of creative possibilities for what may be happening when you get to these supranuclear densities, up to several times a regular nuclear density, perhaps in the center of the star. One possibility is that they really are predominantly neutron stars. But even then, you would maybe have 95% neutrons, 5% protons, basically for balance. So they're not entirely neutrons. They are lying to you about that. So you have potentially very, very neutron-rich material. But there are also other possibilities, because the gravitational confinement buys you time for weak interactions to operate and to form potentially stable states of strange matter as well. And this is the only place in the universe where, if there is stable strange matter, this is where it's forming. And it could take various different forms. One possibility is that the strange quarks are still locked up in particles in the form of hyperons, where you have 3 quarks and at least one of them is a strange quark. And you might have maybe 10 or 15% hyperons in the inner core of the star. The other possibility is that we form deconfined quark material. So essentially, you get rid of these bound particles and we have just some kind of up-down strange quark mix instead in the cores of neutron stars. And trying to find that will be absolutely fascinating. So there are all kinds of fun possibilities for what might be happening here in terms of our ideas about nuclear theory. Now, to put this in a slightly broader context, what we're trying to do is explore the phase diagram of the universe. And this is my phase diagram of the entire universe. It's very, very simple. I have temperature here on the y-axis, chemical potential / density on the x-axis. If you're a physicist, focus on chemical potential. If you're an astronomer, focus on density, whatever makes you happy there. Basically, we are trying to explore what happens as we go from kind of the regular world around us, basically so relatively low density, basically up towards extremes of temperature and density. Now, we have in principle theory, quantum chromodynamics, which we should be able to solve. It would be lovely if we could solve, to try and work out from first principles what should happen. However, that is computationally extremely challenging. So instead, what we have are phenomenological theories, basically to do with interactions between particles, that we are then going to probe with experiments and with observation. And so here, neutron stars fit into this broader picture. Basically, what happens as you go to extremes. Our colleagues working on heavy ion collision experiments, traveling down to Switzerland, for example, are probing this kind of high temperature, low to intermediate density regime up here. People working on neutron star mergers are working slightly in the middle regime. And if you're working purely on neutron stars, you're working in the high density, very, very low temperature regime. And so essentially all of these things fit together. But neutron stars basically are the places where you get this highly neutron-rich matter and this potential for stable states of strange matter. But we do form part of this wider continuum of efforts. So how do we, as astronomers, go about finding something that we can measure, basically with our telescopes, that we can then give to the nuclear physicists to help them figure out exactly what is going on here? And all of the chain of logic that we follow is summarized in this diagram here. So what I've talked about so far is the uncertainty in core composition. Do we have just primarily neutrons? Do we have hyperons? Do we have deconfined quarks in the core? So this is kind of the microphysics, the types of particles present and the forces between them and the uncertainties there. This sets on the larger scale the equation of state, so the relationship between pressure and density within the neutron star. For those of you working on neutron star mergers going, hey, temperature should be there too. Yes, it should. But I'm going to focus on cold neutron stars. I will ignore temperature. It is one of the few things that I do not have to worry about. I have many other things to worry about. But in principle, this should be there as well. So what you're seeing here are a range of currently feasible equations of state. The pale blue band is a parameterized family of models that stretches across that whole band. Different compositions and different ways of describing the forces involved. I still need to go one step further to something to do with my star. But fortunately, as you all know, we can build stars using the stellar structure equations. You have to use the relativistic stellar structure equations, the TOV equations, for example, if you're not rotating. And then basically the equation of state is an ingredient that goes into those structure equations. You pick a central density, you integrate outwards towards the surface of the star, and you obtain a mass and a radius. Tweak your central density, repeat again, and gradually you trace out a mass-radius relationship, which is what you're seeing up here on the top right. So this is the range of predictions associated with each of those equations of state. So to distinguish between them, we would really like to be able to measure the mass-radius relationship, ideally to a few percent, to try and distinguish between these models. So I still need something that I can actually observe. But thankfully, we have relativity, because the mass and the radius, together with the spin of the neutron star, set its exterior spacetime. Any photon traveling towards us from the surface of the star or emitted from the surface picks up the imprint of relativistic effects, which we understand extremely well how to model. So in principle, we can take the surface emission, we can model that with relativistic models, and it turns out we can extract information about mass and radius. We can then in principle trace out the mass-radius relationship. I can hand that back basically through the equation of state to my nuclear physics colleagues, and voila, they can work out what is happening in the core of the star, at least in theory. So this is kind of the goal of what NICER is trying to do, is using this technique. So let me now introduce you properly to NICER. This is NICER prior to its launch. Basically, the photo gives you some idea of the size, and I promise you these are regular-sized human beings, basically for context. It involves X-ray concentrator optics, basically with silicon drift detectors. It's a soft X-ray band detector, sensitive in about the 0.2 to 12 keV band, so similar to XMM Newton. In fact, only 52 of the detectors have ever worked. That was also the case before launch. And it's about twice the area of XM Newton, but it has fantastic spectral and time resolution. This is one of my favorite pictures of all time of this spacecraft, because when my kids were a little bit younger, the oldest one is now a teenager and she hates me telling this story, so I have to do it. She looked at this and she said, "Mama, ninjas!" Yes, Mama works with ninjas. She now knows this is a lie as well, but this is still one of my favorite pictures. NASA launched in the middle of June 2017. It went up on a Falcon 9. And basically it is installed onto the International Space Station. Okay? So this is quite unusual for an X-ray telescope. Usually they're free flying. You can go online, find videos of NICE being pulled out of the trunk and installed on the space station. So it's kind of a nice thing to actually watch. And of course, the nice thing is you can also take pictures of it, basically because it's stuck on the space station. So there is NASA up at the top. If anyone has the Lego International Space Station, there is no NICER on it, but you can make one. I have made one and stick it on the end. And Keith Gendreau, the PI, has a nice 3D print thing to make your own mini NICER to stick onto the model as well. And also you can take movies of it, which is even better. You actually get to see what your telescope is doing. So here is NICER on the space station, very sped up. It will swing around in just a moment and you'll be able to see the detectors. As it comes around, hopefully, you can see the solar panels of the space station. Here it comes around and there's the concentrator optics. It's a complicated environment to work in. We've other experiments going on in the vicinity. Sometimes there are spacewalks, basically which happens. So in that case, sometimes the instrument has to be stowed. It is designed to withstand being kicked by an astronaut, just in case, which is good. But basically, we have to obviously go along with the spacecraft, the ISS orbit. We have solar panels moving around, and that kind of sets where exactly we can look. And again, when also resupply missions come in, typically NICER is also stowed out of the way. But we take advantage of all the energy infrastructure, the data transfer, and so on, and that brings the cost of the mission right down, basically to kind of $40–50 million or so, which is cheap for an X-ray telescope. Okay, so there's NICER basically moving around in its orbit. So let me come back then to the technique that we're using. NICER is using surface emission, which I already said. However, it's also focusing on a very specific type of X-ray surface emission from neutron stars. We are picking stars that have hotspots of some kind, so that the spectrum and the flux essentially changes as the star rotates. And you can see here a nice little kind of cartoon movie showing some of the effects that we're using. In Newtonian gravity, when the spot goes around the back of the star, the emission vanishes. Okay? When you go into relativistic gravity, suddenly in this particular setup, I can see both poles of the star. And also now that the spot goes around the back, basically it doesn't vanish entirely. Okay, so this is one of the relativistic effects, essentially, that we're exploiting in our modeling. But we're not just counting total flux, we're also looking at the full variation of the spectrum in order to do our modeling. Now, in doing the modeling, basically everything will depend on the mass and the radius, but also a host of other parameters as well, like the hotspot location. And those are parameters in the modeling that we do as well. The particular class of neutron stars that we're looking at are X-ray rotation-powered millisecond pulsars. So these are old neutron stars. They've gone through an accretion spin-up phase, basically where they've accreted matter from a companion, and they spun up to millisecond periods. Some of them are still in a binary system, but no longer accreting. Okay, so for those stars, sometimes we have information from radio timing because of it being in a binary. So we can get perhaps an idea already of what the mass is, perhaps the distance and also the inclination, which are very, very useful to us. But not all of them. Sometimes the companion is completely gone, and then we just have an isolated star. So this is the kind of classic picture, essentially, of the dipole. The X-ray hotspots are coming due to return currents in the magnetosphere. Basically, so we're getting kind of particles, accelerated into the surface, deep heating in the magnetic polar caps, and those hot polar caps are what is emitting the X-rays that we're picking up in the pulsations. So that is the basic idea of the stars that we're looking at. Right. So let's come on in a little more detail to how the process works. We call it pulse profile modeling because we are modeling the pulsation and its profile. First of all, we have to have data. So what you're seeing up here is an actual NICER data set. This is our pulse profile. Huge amount of work goes into making this with data cuts and selection, and then we get sent it by email. No nice observing for us, unfortunately. People just send us a file like this. Basically, what it's showing you are the number of counts or photons binned by rotational phase bin of the neutron star and energy channel, okay, that the photon arrives in. Okay, so this is what is detected by the instrument, but there's a very stable rotators and we can assign photons very precisely to a rotational phase bin. So this is the data we're trying to model. We then need to have a physical model of what is happening because we're going to do Bayesian inference, so we need to have some way of generating synthetic or simulated pulse profiles to compare with the data. So I need to build my physical model. I have my neutron star with its space-time, which I can model very, very well, with the rotating oblateness, for example, put in there. I have to put a distance in, I have to put an observer inclination, which I may not know ahead of time. I have to put an atmosphere model in there for a thin atmosphere layer on the surface. I need to decide how many hot polar cap regions I'm going to allow. I then need to say, okay, if I have a circular hotspot, what's its temperature, what's its size, where is it located on the star? I don't know any of this a priori. So these are all parameters in the model as well. So then doing that, I can generate a simulated pulse profile. But of course, I also need to fold it through an instrument model because NICER is perfect. Our understanding of it is not. I am mandated by the engineers to say that. So basically, we also have a model of the instrument response and how that then affects the data as well. And then finally, from that, I have a synthetic profile for a given choice of parameters that I can compare essentially to the data. I have priors on all of these parameters, some better constrained than others. And then I can do large-scale Bayesian inference and statistical sampling to figure out the posterior distributions of every parameter in the model. So that's the mass and the radius, which I want for my nuclear physics colleagues, but also all of the other parameters. So things like the hotspot properties come out of this as well. So that is the kind of the package that we're trying to do. Highly computationally intensive, also to try and do this at the moment. Let me come on to some of the aspects in a little bit more detail. So these are, again, two pulse profile data sets for the stars that we've analyzed so far. This is the one that you've already seen. It was the first star that we analyzed. This is 1.9 megasecond of data. Okay, so several weeks of data. It's a 205 Hz pulsar. It's not in the binary system, so we have no information about its mass. But this is our second brightest source, and I'll come on later to why we didn't start with the brightest one. What you're seeing up top is the bolometric pulse profile. So now I'm summing up over the energy channels, and you can see this very clear double-peaked pulse profile, and these are two rotational cycles shown here. It's a very clear double-peak structure. On the right-hand side is the weakest source that we analyzed. So again, double-peak pulse profile in the bolometric pulse, way harder to see that in the energy resolved pulse profile. This is 1.6 megaseconds of data that went into doing this. It's a 346 Hz pulsar. And the reason we did it is because this one is in a binary. It is a 2.1 solar mass neutron star. So it's the heaviest neutron star that we know. And so fascinating from an equation of state perspective because it has potentially the highest central density. So this one was a real stretch for NICER. It's quite far away. Really hard to do, but really interesting. So we spent time modeling this one as well. Okay, so these are our kind of bounding our quality of data sets that we have at the moment, and we continue to build those up. We then need to have a simulation and inference code. So I'm going to talk mostly about the Amsterdam developed simulation and inference code, which is XPSI. If you want to know more about it, it's available on GitHub. Please go download it and play with it and have some fun with it. So basically this does two things. It does the simulation part, simulating the pulse profiles for a choice of model parameters, and then it does the large-scale inference using open source samplers. Primarily right now we're working with Multinest, although we're broadening that out as well. There's more than one analysis group within the NICER collaboration. Cole Miller's team, for example, at the University of Maryland, have an independent pipeline with an independent simulation and inference code. So although I'll talk mostly about results from the Amsterdam group, there's also that group going as well, and we cross-compare our results and our different pipelines as well when we publish our results. It's a very computationally intensive process because there's a large parameter space, so we also have to beg regularly for large amounts of supercomputer time to make this work. So before we got started on all of our analysis, we did a lot of cross tests on the ray tracing to make sure we were doing things correctly, and we've also done some parameter recovery simulations, and we continue trying to build those up as well. Right, next part of the model. the NICER instrument response. So basically, this is a typical model for how we treat the NICER instrument. This is the NICER effective area, basically, and here is the energy shown here on the bottom. So we have basically a nominal effective area profile for the instrument for the observations that we take. And essentially, we allow a kind of 10% uncertainty in that, and we put a prior on that uncertainty as well. Okay, so we allow a bit of uncertainty in the instruments. We could do more sophisticated things with calibration sources, and that's something we're discussing as well, of how to try and model the instrumental uncertainty. Yeah.
There are very sharp features there.
Yes, there are.
I have two questions.
Yes.
What are they? And then can you exploit that, which shouldn't be present in a neutron star emission, to better calibrate this curve?
Not particularly, because it falls in the middle of an energy bin, basically, at the moment. So yeah, these are instrumental edges due to the silicon detectors. But yeah, they're annoying, but there's nothing we can do about this. Is how we detect the X-rays. Basically, but yeah, getting that calibration right. It would be nice if we could have some better idea of this, but right now we're kind of baby steps on this one.
What is the calibration information you're taking, and like how often do you take the calibration frame?
Right, so right now we are very unsophisticated. We assume an energy independent uncertainty of just plus minus 10% Gaussian. Okay, so really, really, really simple. And that's the kind of benchmark. Ask any X-ray telescope person, they go, oh, it's about 10%. But there's an entire working group of people, as I now know, worrying about X-ray instrument calibration and cross calibration. There's IACHEC. Anyone's involved in this? I never knew this committee existed. I never wanted to know this committee existed. There's reams of people who really care about this stuff, and it's extremely important. We also know there is likely to be energy-dependent calibration uncertainty in there as well. And our first analysis, we actually tried to do this using the crab as a calibration source, but the crab is not great for the other nice sources. So in the end, we've taken that uncertainty out again. And I still have a hope at some point we will get better calibration sources, try some cost calibration with other instruments as well, and try to put that in as a factor. We have the potential for doing that in the code, but right now we haven't really settled on a good calibration source to use. But this does not fully capture, I think, all of the potential uncertainty in the calibration. And there are other teams who've done some quite sophisticated things for other instruments, but so we have issues already with too many parameters, and we're shying away from putting more uncertainty in here as well. Okay, now we come to the really nasty piece, but one I think several people in this room possibly work on. You should work harder on it because this is horrible. We need to put in some idea of what the hot polar caps look like. So we turn to our pulsar theorist colleagues, and there are some in the collaboration, and we say, hey, tell us what kind of shapes you expect. It's been 50 years. Tell us what you expect. And they kind of laugh hysterically and say, we have no idea. More specifically, we have ideas, but it's tricky. So they will give us figures like the one on the right here, which is a return current simulation to say, this is the return current, the heating should roughly follow this. So, okay, so I have maybe a circle and maybe a crescent forming there, maybe some temperature gradients. Yeah, this is complex, but I need to put this in my models. I can't allow every single mesh point on the star to emit with its own profile because I'm going to struggle to do this computationally. So what we decided to do, basically all the teams involved, is we build simple parameterized models of a range of surface patterns. So, for example, we typically assume in the Amsterdam modeling 2 separate emitting regions. Simplest model, 2 circular hotspots. Okay, they can be anywhere on the star as long as they don't touch. Each one can have its own size and temperature. So that's the simplest model. We can then step it up and allow there to be a core region in each of the 2 emitting regions. Then perhaps we allow that core to be off center. And then finally, we allow them to kind of slide over the top of each other. And this one up here, if you allow the red region to be blank, not to emit, you can create a crescent, for example, from that. So by doing this and allowing a range of sizes and positions, we can recreate a bunch of more complex shapes that are motivated by pulsar theory. And so hopefully we capture the kind of range of possibilities that people are thinking about. The other team have a slightly different way of parameterizing things. So this is one of the things where we look for cross-checks as well.
You use T and say temperature.
Yes.
Is this thermal emission, or is that just an effective intensity?
Yeah, it's thermal emission. So one of our basic assumptions is that it's deep heated atmosphere thermal emission. We have now tested this in a bit of detail. I'll come on to this at the end as to what kind of, if there's other sources of heating, what that would do. But yeah, we're assuming deep heating basically due to the return currents in a pure thermal spectrum through a hydrogen atmosphere in principle. Okay, so basically we get our data set. So we had our first data set quite shortly after NICER started operating. It took about a year to build up a data set. We started analyzing it, and then we cranked the handle on this pulse profile modeling process. All of the inference, you produce a whole load of corner plots. You stare at them until your eyes go slightly crossed. We do model comparison as we work up the sequence of, do we need more complex models? Are we happy with where we are? Can we stop? We have various measures of model quality, and we arrive at a preferred solution out of that model space with posterior distributions. So this is the first surface map that we produced. So this is for pulsar J0030, and this just made us laugh so much looking at this, because this doesn't look like a dipole. We are looking at the star from one hemisphere. The preferred solution that we have has one quite small hot polar cap, and the other one is this kind of long extended crescent region, basically on the other side of the star, but again, both on the same hemisphere. And then as it spins around, it gives rise to this double peak pulse profile. The other team, different way of parameterizing the surface patterns, but a very, very similar surface pattern emerged from their analysis as well. So this was our first map. And remember, this is a map of a star that is the size of Amsterdam, thousands of light years away. And we've done it just using counting X-ray photons and a bit of relativity. We can make a map of the surface, which still kind of blows my mind. Now, you will notice it is not looking like that. There is no way you get that from this kind of hot polar cap region. We need something for the magnetic field locally to the surface that would look a bit more like this. So perhaps an offset dipole, perhaps some kind of quadrupolar component as well. We spent a long time discussing in the collaboration if the crescent was a smiley face or a frowny face, which was allowed by the pulsar theorists, and I don't know what they've decided yet, but this is something that we then hand to them and say, okay, how do you make this pulse profile? Yeah, this is really, really tricky. And my thought originally was when we publish this, we'll have within a couple of weeks, some pulsar team will arrive and go, there is no way that this explains the gamma ray emission or explains the radio emission. Forget it. You guys have allowed too broad a range of prior space. And sure enough, several weeks later, there was a pulsar team paper, but thank God actually saying this is not crazy. You can actually make this work. So that's nice. So this is something that we're still actively discussing with people and working on. I think there's a lot of room for improvement here as well. There is then the question for all of you working on core collapse supernovae, stellar evolution, how on earth did you get this? Okay, these are old stars. Was it born like that? Did it turn out like that through accretion? Basically, so that's also one thing we're taking a look at. Pushpita Das will be moving to Columbia in April when she's finished her PhD, has been looking at what it means for accreting pulsars during the accretion phase. If the field looks like this, would we see them as accreting pulsars or not? And the answer is no, maybe not actually. So we're now doing some detailed 3D simulations of this as well to try and understand the implications of this kind of field structure for the accretion phase. But big question to everyone working on this, please try and figure this out because this is kind of fun. We've also done this for the massive pulsar, which was the second source. It was not a source that we had intended to analyze next. We'd been planning to go on to our brightest source at this point, but then our radio pulsar colleagues dropped us this 2.1 solar mass neutron star. And we went, oh, we can just see it with NICER. We can probably get a data set, let's do this. So we switched to do analysis for this one instead. Super, super fun. Again, we were able to make a surface map, basically for this one. Geometry is different. We are looking at this one along the equator, and that's why we're able to get a really good mass measurement for it, because there's a Shapiro delay in the radio pulsar timing. Okay, so we have very, very constrained inclination angle. Simpler hotspot model seems to work. The data set's not as good, so that may be an artifact here that we're seeing, but we have tried some different surface pattern models, and we don't seem to need anything more complex than two small spots. But again, they're not quite antipodal. Okay, so it's still not a perfect dipole that's falling out of this as well. And we've now managed to put some quite tight limits on how non-dipoly it is. There's at least a 25-degree offset basically in there that we think we're seeing. So basically, when we went through this, we made our surface maps, but I also promised you masses and radii. So let me show you masses and radii. So let's go into the core of the star. So what I'm showing on here is mass versus radius and our credible regions for the mass and radius that we infer from the Boss series. I'm showing a bunch of possible equation of state models on here as well, just to give you an idea of the range of possibilities. Okay, but there are many, many more that you could draw on here as well, spanning the whole space. So basically, this is the first star that we did, the one we didn't have a mass prior for. It's quite broad so far, this first measurement, about plus or minus 10%. This is a 68%, 95% credible region. But it's, 1.4 solar mass, 12, 13 kilometers or so in terms of the radius, so right in the middle of the parameter space. This is the high mass pulsar, so the mass is known very well a priori, and we don't tend to change much from that in our analysis. But the radius comes out surprisingly similar. And this region in particular over here is very strongly ruled out. So these very soft equations of state, basically they end up with quite low radius. And those are quite strongly ruled out, and that has interesting implications potentially for quark matter. You can talk to Jonas for more details about this as well. So basically we have our two radius measurements coming from the map, basically 2019 and 2021. One interesting thing that came out of this analysis was the importance of background for this particular star. So we did not just analyze NICER data, we also had an XMM data set for this star that we put in there as well. So why did we do that? We did that to try and get a good idea of the background. NICER's on the space station, it has a high instrumental background. Okay, it's in this high particle environment close to the Earth. So we have quite low signal to noise, basically due to all this kind of high particle background, space weather, and so on. So basically we have a large source of unpulsed emission in our pulse profile as well. So basically this pulse profile that I showed you before sits on this kind of constant layer of something else, okay? And there's also a constant spectral component in here as well. Now that unpulsed component can be formed of several different things. One is that it's astrophysical background, so another star, AGN in the field of view, it's always an AGN, hate AGN, don't want them, they're everywhere, very annoying. It can be particles, but it can also be, for example, due to the spot geometry. So if the spots are sitting overlapping the rotational pole, you're always going to see them, okay? So there'll be a constant component from that. If your star is very compact and the light bending is very strong, you may well also get increased unpulsed component from there as well. So basically by putting this data set in from XMM, XMM has a much better background estimate. So by trying to apply the same models basically to that as well, we have a very clear idea of how many photons should come from the star and how many photons come from all the other stuff. So it basically constrained the background basically slightly independently, or an indirect constraint. So if you look at what it did to the radius, so these are the radius one-dimensional posteriors. NICER only is shown in blue, and there we were getting a radius of about 11 kilometers. When we put in the XMM analysis as well, okay, so with this kind of indirect background constraint, shifted up by a kilometer. And that's because essentially it ruled out these very high compactness solutions. So it told us that the way what we were attributing to background was wrong. We were not allowed to have high compactness solutions because this had to be coming from actual genuine background, could not be coming from the spots, and it ruled out parts of parameter space. We've since been able to repeat this now using new NICER-only background models. The team worked super hard to develop better models for us as well, so we can now do this using NICER models and not having to rely on XMM observations, but they all give consistent results. But it's given us one more thing that we now know it's good to have priors on, models on in our analysis. So in principle, we now have masses and radii. Okay, so now the question is, what do we do with it? So first of all, you can just do plots like I just showed you, and you can draw your equation of state through the line and go, look, it goes through the line. Goes through the middle of my region, everything is fine. So you can do that. But what you should do is a second stage of inference, where you now take your equation of state model, basically, which is also a parameterized model potentially, with priors on those parameters. And you should basically then do a second stage of inference using the mass radius posteriors that we produce, basically, and going back through this second stage to come up with posteriors on your equation of state model. And from there, you can generate a mass radius relationship with uncertainties on that as well. So you can transform these individual mass radius measurements into a mass radius relationship. So that is the second phase of the analysis, is to do this kind of equation of states analysis. So yeah, basically you have to pick in principle, maybe a parameterized model. You have to also search over different central densities, and doing this, you will end up with a mass radius relationship. So I just want to give you an idea of how that process goes. So for example, we've done a bunch of models using A particular equation of state model, we use a chiral effective field theory informed lower density model, basically for the region around the neutron star crust. And then we use the parameterized model for the high density parts, piecewise polytrope models, which is used very commonly in gravitational wave analysis as well. And we have a second parameterized model using the speed of sound instead, which has the nice benefit that you don't get discontinuities in the speed of sound. And we have some constraints on how speed of sound should behave in ultra-dense matter way above neutron star densities. So you can come up with a kind of form, a possible function this could take. You can have parameters in there, and then we can parameterize our equation state model like this and obtain pressure and density essentially by taking an integral over sound speed. So, you can pick whatever model in principle you like to do this kind of analysis. We can then run through this second stage of inference. So first of all, you need to look at your prior space, basically to understand what your model is doing, and you will find, no matter how open you are with your model, it's a model which is basically a sum of terms. Let's say you pick uniform distributions on all your parameters, it's still going to end up peaked somewhere. Okay, so your prior model will have a preference to mass radius relationship. This in black is the 95% prior space on those two different parameterizations that I talked about. And you can see they have slightly different preferences. Basically, this space extends more to higher radii, for example, than the other one. So it's good to keep an eye on your priors. We can then, first of all, say, we know we have 2.1 solar mass neutron stars. Radio people have measured that. It's a very, very important constraint. And that already cuts you down to these green regions shown here, basically for the two models. And you see the different shapes because of the different parameterizations. So that already cuts your mass radius relationship in principle down by quite a lot. We can then go ahead and add in extra constraints. So what I've now put in here are the first mass radius measurement that we made with NICER. And I've also added in, there are lots of gravitational wave people here, so I've added in the two tidal deformabilities that we have from gravitational wave measurements. So you see things shifting about a little bit as I add those in with the same equation of state model, and the mass radius relationship shifting a little bit in there as well. Now I can pop in the radius measurement for the high mass pulsar, and everything shifts and narrows a little bit extra. So basically, as we start to combine these measurements, you can see the mass radius band narrowing, and it kind of looks impressively narrow, but the priors are still important in here as well. So basically, we need to keep adding data to make this more and more robust and to depart more and more still from the priors. So that is the kind of process that we're doing to get towards the equation of state. And again, then we hand it to our nuclear physics colleagues to say, right, if this is the mass radius relationship, what does it mean for a deconfined quark phase? Is this feasible, and under what kind of circumstances? The other thing which we can do, which we would quite like to do long term when we have enough points, is we can cross compare. So here are my two NICER measurements, for example. If I want to analyze those independently, let's say, ask, what do I get from NICER with all of our model assumptions and so on, and then I want to compare that to what the gravitational wave people do, because maybe we don't do the model in the same way. We each have our own systematics and our different populations. What you're seeing here is the band, in principle, covered for this equation of state model that I computed essentially earlier. For GW 170817, the tidal deformability from that, basically, and this is, I think, is the 95% region, basically, that we've computed here for one of our equation of state models. So this will be the radius region that will be implied by that equation of state model for a 1.4 solar mass neutron star. So basically, it's not incompatible with the NICER measurements, so it pushes us off to this side. But certainly things are looking okay at the moment in terms of compatibility. Rather more fun has been this measurement from PREX. PREX is the lead radius experiment. This is the lab experiment, basically doing parity violating electron scattering on neutron-rich nuclei. Okay, so lead nuclei, very neutron-rich, they have a neutron skin on the outside. Measuring that, in principle, tells you something about how neutrons and protons interact, and you can extrapolate from that to what neutron stars do. Okay, through quite a lot of steps, but you can do it. Their analysis, basically, which was published a year or so ago, would put the radius of a 1.4 solar neutron star up here, which is not so great for gravitational waves and PREX, because they don't really overlap. NICER, we are friends with everyone. Okay, we sit in the middle, we make everyone happy. Great stuff. PREX, the picture's got a bit more confusing now because there is another experiment, CREX, the calcium radius experiment. MREX is coming as well, and it's all over the place. CREX does not agree with PREX either. Okay, so they have 2 lab experiments doing neutron radii of nuclei which don't agree with each other. So I think they need to sort that out as well before we start to definitively worry about this one or not. So that's kind of a fun aside of things that are going on in the lab with tiny nuclei that also have implications for what we are doing as well. Right, let me come on to what is coming next for NICER. We have 7 sources in total that we can analyse that are bright enough for NICER to build up data sets in a reasonable amount of time, pending no one discovering some other core source that we haven't looked at yet. NICER is definitely going to run till 2025. We hope it will carry on beyond that if the space station survives. No one else apparently wants our slot on the space station, which is good, so please nobody ask for it, because we'd like to keep this experiment running. And it does all kinds of cool black hole stuff as well, so plenty going on there. NICER has one minor issue right now. It has a light leak. There was a micrometeorite strike, which has caused a small problem with light leakage. For our sources, for the mass radius analysis, it's not a problem. We don't have to worry about that, but some of the target of opportunity, things have been hit by that a little bit. But there are discussions ongoing about how they might do a repair for that, which is, again, on a free-flying satellite, you would never even be able to discuss this possibility. On the space station, you can, which is outstanding. Right, what have we got coming? 3 of our sources don't have mass priors, so we have no idea where they're going to end up lying. 2 of the ones coming soon do. The next one to come will be this guy, 0437. It is a 1.4 solar mass pulsar, plus minus 3% basically on the radius. So we use that as a prior. It's our brightest source. It is a pain because there is an AGN in the field of view there. So we have to observe it off-axis, which means that it took us a while to figure out what the right instrument response should be for an off-axis observation. But it's a beautiful, complex data set. I have a graduate student, Devashi Chowdhury, who's been working on this for ages. The data are too good. But we have an answer for that one. We're doing cross-checks now in the collaboration. And that one, I hope, will be coming very, very soon. We have this guy, high mass neutron star, more complicated spectrum. We may need to deal with a non-thermal component in there as well. But that one will be interesting to see where it lies compared to the even higher mass one. So many more measurements coming, we hope. Plus, better data sets on the ones we've already published. As we get more photons, the uncertainty regions should in principle shrink. Now, this one, we've got an updated measurement coming very soon for the high mass one. Basically, that's coming very soon. This one is complicated. I have a postdoc who came in to do some really detailed analysis of this one. And it's driven her absolutely crazy, I think. So this was the result that we published in 2019. Okay, so having then analysed the next source, we decided we'd like to do this with higher resolution on our sampler settings. There were a whole bunch of things we really wanted to test with parameter recovery and so on for this complex pattern that we came up with. So she took that data set and she did a really thorough reanalysis of it. Now, if we just analyse the NICER data, we poured lots of supercomputer hours into it. This comes out again as the preferred solution, the spot and the crescent, all good, weird, non-dipolar thing, mass and radius where they were before, excellent. Then we added the background because we have an XMM observation for this star. We had compared to the predicted background for XMM in our first paper, and we knew it was a little bit off, but like a little bit, like a factor of 2 at some of the lower energies. And we thought that's not a big deal. Factor of 2, we're astronomers. Probably not an issue. It's an issue. When you put this in, so what you did was do the joint analysis as we did for the previous star, and everything changes. This star has a very, very multimodal solution space. And as you put the background constraints in, you gravitate now towards different preferred solutions. She also tries some more complicated surface pattern models with dual temperature components. And now we have 2 answers, which is fun, or 2 potential answers. This one is the first one. So now we have hotspots with, rather than single temperature components, dual temperature components. The background is now fitting extremely, extremely well. It's gone up in radius. The P-Rex people are happy. Okay, so if you work on P-Rex, this is your solution. We have a second mode as well. This is the second one. So gravitational wave people, this is your solution, basically, because you can have this one. What's interesting about these, so it does move around, okay, but depending on which solution you pick. However, the geometries are different and the surface configurations are different. They are both closer to being antipodal. So this very non-antipodal structure we had before is going away a little bit with these things. In terms of Bayesian evidence, the previous mode is preferred. However, this one appears to be more compatible with the gamma ray observations. So the pulsar theorists like this one a bit better. So we're now reaching a question of, wow, we might actually need the magnetosphere to determine what is happening with the mass and radius. So again, pulsar people, please work harder because we need an answer from you as to what's going on here. We probably could try and distinguish between them properly using this data set. However, we already have a much larger data set for this source, which we're finishing processing now. So we made the decision to stop the analysis, save our computer time to use on the new bigger data set with nicer background models as well. And I hope that that analysis will help us home in on which one of these answers, or perhaps something completely different, basically might end up being the preferred solution. So this one is complicated. This one, on the other hand, really remains very stable no matter what reanalysis we do on it. So for example, we've done a different atmosphere analysis, we've double checked what happens if you put helium in. For example, we've double checked if you have non-deep heating and external heating, it does not budge. That high mass one is incredibly, incredibly stable. So this is all looking quite well behaved. This one is looking much more dependent on model factors, but I'm hoping we'll be able to home in on it. So new larger data set coming soon for this one, and let's see where it settles. Okay, I want to finish off just by saying a few words about new telescopes. NICER is pioneering this new technique, a new way of mapping the surface and trying to get mass and radius. But there are other types of neutron star with hotspots, basically, and this is the target for new generations of telescopes. Athena, which I haven't shown here, or new Athena now, can target the rotation of hard pulsars. We're also looking at potential large area telescopes which go to higher energies as well, EXTV or STROBE-X, which has just been submitted as a NASA Pro class proposal, where basically you would have the soft coverage of NICER, kind of mega NICER plus a large high energy detector. And you could use these to build up fantastic data sets also on the accreting stars as well. So this is something that we're working on, of trying to make this work to get new classes of stars in here as well. Different astrophysics going on here. We have the potential to do accretion powered pulsars now in doing this, where the hotspots now come from channeled accretion. But we have things like the disk playing a role, which we now have to deal with. We're also looking at thermonuclear burst oscillation sources. These are accreting stars that build up an ocean of hydrogen and helium, which explodes periodically, gives us a bright X-ray burst, and some of those bursts have hotspots in them. And we might be able to use those to do this pulse profile modeling as well, but they are highly variable. The advantage of doing this is that, for example, there are stars that are both accretion powered pulsars and burst oscillation sources. So for the same star, I can use two different techniques. And you can take a bet now as to whether you reckon we'll get the same mass and radius. I have a couple of students working on this for a couple of stars. We can also combine with Jonas's burst models that he's using as well. And again, are we going to get 3 agreeing results?
Hopefully,
yeah, he's very optimistic. I am completely sure we'll get 3 different ones, but we will see. We can cross-check things with these stars, which would be really great. Burst oscillations, I'm just going to mention quickly because we spent a lot of time on this basically over the last couple of years. So we have hotspots that form during thermonuclear bursts. We can see a pulse signal in a light curve of a type 1 burst. Here's a typical type 1 burst, lasts about 20 seconds or so, bright light curve that goes up, and if you track a frequency, you can see drifting frequency in there. So there's some kind of potentially mobile hotspot on the surface, and we have no idea how that forms. We have all kinds of lovely theories. I've worked on this for a long time as well. No idea what it's caused by. Is it caused by flame spread and flame stalling? Are there modes being excited in the ocean and the atmosphere, for example, that give you patterns? Is it some kind of weird convective thing? You know, we don't know what causes these spots, but we'd like to be able to understand that. They were discovered in 1996, and it's kind of rubbish that we still don't know what they're caused by. So we are hopeful that by doing pulse profile modeling, we might learn not only the mass and the radius, but also what the spot is doing and actually be able to map that. And then maybe finally we can figure out what is going on with these things. So I have a graduate student, Eve Kinney, who's been working on this. So the problem is it's really dynamic. So I'm building pulse profiles out of something that's going up and down like this. So the amplitude of the pulsation, we have one source where the amplitude of the pulsation remains the same. But because the background is going up and down, that means the spot has to be changing as well. And we don't know how, in theory, it's changing, just that it's changing. So he's been trying to test parameter recovery and how we deal with this. And so he's been doing a ton of simulations with lots of different possible models for how the spot might be evolving over time, and looking at how we deal with this impulse profile modeling. One option is that you just ignore the variability. I take my burst, I build a pulse profile, and I say, okay, I'm going to do modeling on this. I hope I recover kind of average parameters. Mass and the radius should come out okay, and maybe an average temperature. So here are some simulations, basically where we have an input value of mass and radius. The green is what we get out. Okay, so it's dire at recovering the mass and the radius. Okay, so we cannot ignore the variability. We get lovely tight constraints that are totally wrong. Not good. Strategy two is that we deal with the variability. So we can chop the burst up into little segments and say it's pretty much constant in those tiny segments. And you can either do that just saying it does whatever it likes in those segments, we make no restriction, or you can pretend you have a theory, put some priors on how much it's allowed to vary, and see if that helps. If you do that, the good news is you can then start to recover the parameters you put in, but computationally it kills you. So your computation load can rise by a factor of 10 to 100 by chopping it up into little segments. If you have a theory, it really helps. So a theory is good. Please come up with a theory, because that would really, really help us to try and figure this out, to put some limits on this. But in principle, at least, given a big enough computational hammer, we can actually do this, which is incredibly reassuring. And that's what he's now working on, to see if we can get some constraints from this. So let me summarize where we are. NICER is using a completely new technique for determining neutron star properties. We found out all kinds of interesting things about the analysis process as we've gone ahead with doing this. Like all the things that LIGO found out through simulations before detection, we are finding out as we go, which is kind of fun. We've so far measured the size for 2 neutron stars, including the highest mass neutron star known. Third is coming soon, and there will be 7 results in total by the end of the mission. We're making maps, and I said that's the thing that I absolutely love about this, that we're using photons and relativity and a teeny tiny telescope on the space station to make a map of something thousands of light years away and tell you where the hot polar caps are. And my absolute favorite achievement is that this mission patch, it's just wrong. I'm very happy that we've broken that, and this is the pinnacle of my career that we've trashed this. And I'll actually be quite disappointed if they end up with dipolar after all, because then I will have to eat my words on that. I will stop there and take any questions. Thank you.
Other questions? You can just call on people. I'll shout.
Can you elaborate a bit further what's the problem with gamma rays in the pulsars? You said that one of the more stars fits better with the gamma rays and without. So.
Yeah, actually, I can't go into too much more detail on this. This is something that our gamma ray people have told me, that the geometry, you have to look carefully at the precise geometry that they've come up with. So the 2 different modes have a slightly different alignment and a slightly different latitude of where the spots would be. Both of them are closer to antical, but one is kind of closer to being across the equator, and one is closer towards being towards the pole. And apparently one of those is better aligned with their current gamma ray modeling. Whether it is better aligned with all current gamma ray modeling, I don't know. This is purely come from one group within the NICER collaboration.
Yeah, because you have to actually assume where those gamma rays come from.
Yes, you do, exactly.
Okay.
So this is basically Alice Harding and Dora Waddy's things group and their modeling. And so they say from their modeling, there's a preferred answer coming out of here, basically, which would be nice. I mean, the ideal solution is we end up non-dependent and one solution clearly stands out. But right now, they both appear to be equally good quality. Evidence favors the other one. And the pulsar theorists tell us in principle, they would like the other one to be fit.
Interesting.
Just curious, when you say it's computationally impossible, like what are we talking about? Are we talking about like computer being too small, or is like just you do some back of envelope and it's like, oh no, we need to compute this for millions of years?
For the quantum chromodynamics.
Yeah, like for example, like a parameter estimation, what's the typical time?
As far as I know, the QCD calculation for first principles for a neutron star is impossible.
No, I mean like the parameter estimation.
But the parameter estimation, okay, so we are talking our most intensive run for O4 37, which is the one that we're about to publish, best data set. Our production quality run was close to 1 million hours on our national supercomputer.
CPU hours.
Yeah, out of a 12 million hour proposal. So that's a substantial amount of, we were watching it converging with the kind of, please terminate before we get to the 1 million, because I don't want to write another proposal so soon after writing the last one.
Right, and that's like 1 million CPU hours on how many likelihood call? Is that because the likelihood call is expensive, or like the geometry is?
The likelihood evaluation is about a second. Basically, it's just the sheer volume of parameter spaces. When you get to see these dual temperature components for each hotspot, then you've got, 2 overlapping circles of varying size and temperature for each magnetic polar cap. You've got a position for each one of them, a size for each one of them. And so when you get away from this simple 2 circular hotspot model, you rapidly ramp up to about 26 parameters plus the background marginalization. When you go to accreting stars, it's even worse. Accreting pulsars, which my graduate student Bas Dorsman is working on, there's 1 more parameter in the atmosphere models. And that pushes us really to the limit of feasibility. So we are thinking we're going to have to basically at some point call a giant group halt, in which we take 6 months to figure out something way more fancy in order to be able to make this work. Because I think for the physics that we want to do, it's really pushing the limits of what's possible with us computer resources. So I want fancy techniques for making this work. And my graduate students are desperate to go work on this. It's like, please finish your current papers, then go crazy. Fly free, make it faster.
What are the theoretical limits on the surface emissivity that you can constrain? So like for the Euclidean problem with no space-time, it's just straight ray tracing onto a spherical surface. You get, for every YLM on the surface, sorry, for every L, you get 1 of the M's.
Yes.
Is that improved because now you have all these nonlinear, lensing effects and Doppler boosting and beaming and everything else?
Yeah, so it does help, but of course it gives us a bit of extra uncertainty as well. I mean, our biggest limitation, I think, is on small scale features, so that we know with the current resolution we have with NICER, of how many phase bins are sensible to do, what kind of energy resolution is sensible. There is a certain size below which we can't resolve. So your tiny spot, I don't know if it's a ring or Baby Yoda's face or whatever, I can't tell. There's no way to know this. So that's tricky. There are probably other regions of parameters, but again, I can't tell if it's a crescent or an oval or something towards the edge. So fine resolution is not something we can do. It's something we'll be able to do better with a larger telescope.
I had a question about the 2D raw data plots you showed of the rotation phase and the energy channel. If you could go back to one of them. It was present for both of the stars where there seemed to be a non-pulsed component. Yeah, for this one, for example, in channel 60.
Yeah.
Or maybe the right, I guess both of them.
Yeah. So
what is that?
These are the instrumental edges. Basically, because this has gone through the instrument response. So you see these kind of features straight across coming from the instrument.
I see.
If you just put the simulated one before it hit the instrument, it's beautiful. Then it's your theorist dream, and then you put it through the instrument, it picks up all these choppy pieces, basically along the way as well.
Thanks again, Anna. We have a reception. And I will say Anna's graciously allowed us to take her out to dinner. There is 1 more spot if someone would like to join dinner. Come talk to me. And first you come, one of you will be served.